The roar of 20,000 voices suddenly died to complete silence. Madison Square Garden, the same arena where Mike Tyson had destroyed opponents with devastating knockouts, now watched in stunned disbelief as the world's most feared boxer collapsed to his knees on TUPAC Shakur's stage, tears streaming down his face as he began revealing the darkest secrets of his tortured soul. What started as a simple guest appearance became the most vulnerable moment in sports history, and what Tyson confessed that night would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. It was March 15, 1996, during one of Tupac's most powerful performances of the year. Tupac was at the height of his fame with Death Row Records, and Madison Square Garden was packed with 20,000 fans who had come to witness hip-hop history in the making. Mike Tyson, who had been one of Tupac's closest friends, had insisted on appearing despite being in the middle of his own personal hell. His marriage to Robin Givens had publicly imploded. Don King was systematically stealing his fortune, and the pressure of being seen as an invincible monster was destroying him from the inside. The evening had started with typical hip-hop energy. The crowd was electric, celebrating Tupac's legacy while mourning his loss. When the host announced that Mike Tyson would be making a special appearance, the arena erupted with anticipation. Everyone expected the usual tough guy persona, maybe a few words about his friendship with Pac, and then a quick exit. But as Tyson walked onto the stage, something was immediately different. The swagger was gone. The intimidating presence that had terrified heavyweight contenders seemed to have evaporated. He looked smaller somehow, more human, more fragile than anyone had ever seen him. "Y'all know me as Mike Tyson, the heavyweight champion," he began, his voice barely audible through the microphone. "But tonight I need to tell you who I really am." The crowd sensed immediately that something unprecedented was happening. This wasn't going to be a typical celebrity appearance. "Tupac was the only person who ever saw through my mask," Tyson continued, his voice already starting to shake. "He was the only one who knew that everything you think you know about me is a lie." The arena went completely silent. 20,000 people could sense they were about to witness something that would change how they viewed one of the most famous athletes in the world. "I've been lying to myself and everyone else for so long that I almost forgot who I really was underneath all the anger and violence," Tyson said, and his first tears began to fall. What happened next would be replayed on television and discussed in psychology textbooks for decades to come. "When I was in prison," Tyson began, his voice breaking completely, "everybody thought I was this tough guy who could handle anything. But the truth is, I was terrified every single day." The crowd was riveted. This level of vulnerability from someone they viewed as superhuman was unlike anything they had ever experienced. "There were nights when I would hide in my cell and cry like a little boy because I was so scared," he continued, now sobbing openly. "Other inmates would try to intimidate me, to test me, and I had to fight just to survive. But the worst part wasn't the physical threats." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, completely unconcerned with how this looked to 20,000 strangers. "The worst part was that I realized I had become exactly what everyone expected me to be, a monster, and I hated myself for it." The emotional weight of his confession was crushing the entire arena. People were crying in the audience, not from sadness, but from the shock of witnessing such raw humanity from someone they thought was incapable of vulnerability. But Tyson was just getting started with his revelations. "You want to know about my marriage to Robin?" he asked, his voice now filled with a pain that was almost unbearable to hear. "Everyone thinks I was this abusive husband who couldn't control his temper. But the truth is, she was destroying me psychologically every single day." The arena was so quiet that his whispered confessions carried clearly to every corner of Madison Square Garden. "She would tell me I was stupid, worthless, that nobody would ever love the real me," he continued. "She would bring other men around and make sure I knew about it. She would humiliate me in front of people and then act like the victim when I got angry." The crowd was getting an education in psychological abuse that most of them had never considered before. "I started believing her," Tyson admitted. "I started thinking that maybe I really was just a violent animal who didn't deserve love or respect. And the more I believed it, the more I became it. But the most devastating revelation was still coming. And Don King, Tyson's voice was now filled with a rage that was different from his usual anger. This was the fury of someone who had been systematically betrayed. That man has been stealing from me since the day I turned professional. Millions and millions of dollars. The business side of his confession was hitting the crowd differently, but with equal impact. He would show me contracts and tell me they said one thing when they actually said something completely different. He knew I couldn't read well enough to understand all the legal language, so he would take advantage of my ignorance. The admission about his literacy struggles added another layer of vulnerability that made his previous achievements seem even more impressive. I made over $300 million in my career, Tyson said, and Don King stole most of it while convincing me that I should be grateful for whatever he left me with. But then Tyson began talking about the source of all his pain, his childhood. None of y'all know what it was like growing up in Brownsville, he said, his voice becoming that of a hurt child rather than a heavyweight champion. My father abandoned me before I was born. My mother worked so hard to keep us alive that I barely saw her. The crowd was completely mesmerized by this journey into the psychology of someone they thought they understood. I was fat. I was poor. I was stupid, and bigger kids would beat me up and take my money, he continued. So I learned that the only way to survive was to become more violent than everyone else. The logic of his transformation was becoming clear to everyone listening. By the time I was 12, I had decided that I would never let anyone hurt me again, and the only way to guarantee that was to make everyone afraid of me. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes red with tears, but somehow more human than anyone had ever seen them. Kiss D'Amato found me and taught me how to box, but he also taught me how to turn my pain into power. The problem was, I never learned how to turn the power off. The reference to his beloved trainer and father figure brought fresh tears to his eyes. When Q's died, I lost the only person who had ever really loved me for who I was, not for what I could do in the ring, he said. And that's when I really became the monster that everyone feared. But the most shocking confession was still to come. The truth is, Tyson said, his voice now barely above a whisper, I've been pretending to be this invincible killer for so long that I forgot I was just a scared little boy who wanted someone to love him. The arena was so quiet that people seemed to be holding their breath. Every time I knocked someone out, every time I acted crazy in public, every time I did something that made people fear me more, it was because I was terrified that if people saw who I really was, they would abandon me just like my father did. The psychological insight was devastating in its honesty and clarity. Tupac was the first person who ever looked past all the violence and anger and saw that scared little boy, Tyson continued. He would tell me, Mike, you don't have to be a monster to be powerful. You can be vulnerable and still be strong. The mention of his friendship with Tupac brought a different kind of emotion to his voice. But I was too scared to believe him, Tyson admitted. I thought that if I stopped being the baddest man on the planet, people would see that I was really just broken inside. What happened next surprised everyone, including Tyson himself. Instead of the usual reaction to vulnerability, pity, discomfort, or embarrassment, the crowd began to respond with something completely different: understanding and acceptance. Someone in the audience shouted, "We love you, Mike," and others began joining in with words of support and encouragement. For the first time in his adult life, Mike Tyson was experiencing unconditional acceptance while being completely authentic about his flaws and fears. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been, he said, his voice still shaking but now carrying a note of hope. But maybe it's not too late to learn. The crowd's response was unlike anything ever heard at Madison Square Garden. 20,000 people were on their feet, not cheering for a knockout or a victory, but showing love and support for someone who had finally found the courage to be honest about his humanity. The immediate impact of Tyson's confession was visible throughout the arena. People were hugging strangers, crying together, and sharing their own stories of struggle and pain with people they had never met. But the long-term impact would be even more significant. Within days, the video of Tyson's breakdown had been seen by millions of people around the world. Mental health professionals began using his confession as an example of how childhood trauma and abuse can manifest in adult behavior. The boxing world was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how the sport exploited young men from disadvantaged backgrounds, and how promoters like Don King had built fortunes on the backs of fighters who were often illiterate and vulnerable. For Tyson personally, the confession became a turning point in his life. The public response showed him that people were capable of accepting and loving him even when he wasn't playing the role of the invincible destroyer. He began working with therapists to address his childhood trauma and learn healthier ways to process his emotions. He started speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of literacy and education. Most importantly, he began to understand that vulnerability was not weakness, but rather the foundation of genuine human connection. The Madison Square Garden confession became a landmark moment in sports psychology, demonstrating how public figures could use their platforms not just for entertainment or promotion, but for healing and education. 28 years later, Mike Tyson's breakdown on Tupac's stage remains one of the most powerful examples of how authentic vulnerability can transform not just individuals but entire communities of people who witness it. The 20,000 people who were present that night became carriers of a different understanding of masculinity, strength, and what it means to be human in a world that often demands we hide our true selves. The stage that had been intended for celebration and remembrance became a platform for healing, showing that sometimes the most important performances are the ones where entertainers risk everything to share their most painful truths. If this story moved you too, hit that like. For more incredible stories, subscribe, and get ready for the next revelation.